August 1984. A small town in Tennessee was gripped by fear. The disappearance of 13-year-old Emily Clark had shaken the close-knit community to its core. Emily was last seen near her school, and when she failed to come home that evening, her family sounded the alarm. Search parties were formed immediately, and the entire town joined the effort. Neighbors, teachers, even passing strangers. Yet as days passed, hope dwindled and desperation grew. 3 days later, when most had begun to fear the worst, a hunter named Bill Sanderson made what the town would forever remember as the grisly discovery. Walking a forest trail south of town, Bill initially thought he'd stumbled across a predator's carnage, but as he approached, his stomach dropped. It wasn't the work of an animal. Lying there in the undergrowth was the lifeless body of Emily Clark, her small frame grotesquely mutilated. Her body told a story of unspeakable cruelty. Every inch seemed to bear the mark of deliberate, methodical violence. Her skin was marked with precise cuts, as though someone had taken their time, savoring each act. The wounds were surgical, intentional, and calculated, without a trace of hesitation. Parts of her body appeared to have been methodically carved, the kind of horrifying detail that made Bill's blood run cold. Though the blood had dried, there were no large pools nearby, suggesting the killer had been meticulous, leaving the scene eerily clean. Bill's gaze darted around, but he saw no fresh footprints, no sign of a struggle. The forest stood unervingly still, as though shielding the horror within. Shrubs and leaves remained undisturbed, and the ground betrayed no evidence of hurried movement. This was no random act of violence. It was as if the killer had chosen this spot deliberately, secluded and silent, perfect for their macabre display. By the time the authorities arrived, the full scope of the horror became clear. FBI agent Andrew Reynolds, a seasoned investigator specializing in serial crimes, studied the scene with a steely focus. He crouched beside the body, his sharp eyes tracing the cuts and positioning. The way the body was laid out, carefully, deliberately, struck him immediately. It lacked the chaos typical of many violent crimes. Instead, it exuded a haunting order, as though the killer had treated their act as a twisted art form. "These cuts aren't random," Reynolds muttered under his breath. His stomach churned at the realization. The precision of the wounds suggested a steady hand, someone skilled and unflinching. Whoever had done this wasn't rushed or panicked. They had planned every detail, executed every motion with the precision of a surgeon performing a procedure. This was no ordinary killer. Emily wasn't a random victim. She was part of something far darker, far more deliberate. Reynolds felt a cold knot in his stomach as the grim reality sank in. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning of a much larger, more horrifying pattern. As he looked over the forest floor one last time, the oppressive silence seemed to whisper a warning. Somewhere, someone was already planning their next move. After the shock of the first crime, Agent Reynolds had no time to rest. He began his investigation immediately, quickly noting several unsettling details that kept him on edge. The missing children cases in this small town seemed oddly similar, as if they were all tied together by one dark hand. He recalled the locals mentioning that this wasn't the first time something like this had happened. It turned out that 10 years earlier, in 1974, a 12-year-old boy named Billy Hauser had disappeared. His body was found a week later, in a river on the outskirts of town. However, as it was later revealed, the case was quickly closed due to lack of evidence. The only suspect was a homeless man, who was soon released because there was no proof connecting him to the crime. The whole situation seemed strange, and perhaps that's why it piqued Reynolds' interest. After reviewing the old reports and interviews, he realized that Billy Hauser's case had been hastily closed. So much had been left unanswered, many leads never followed up. Billy's body had been found in the river, but once again, there were no signs of struggle or assault. This made Reynolds think back to what he had seen in the forest, the body of Emmy Clark, and the strange method of killing. The patterns leading back to Billy looked eerily familiar. But this was only the beginning. A week later, another boy disappeared, 11-year-old Tommy Lewis. The last time he was seen, he was playing outside his house, And when his parents grew worried, a new search effort was launched. No one could have predicted that this case might be linked to the same monster that had taken Emmy Clark. This time, the search didn't take as long. 2 days after Tommy went missing, his body was found in an abandoned greenhouse on the edge of town. It was covered in a thick layer of dust and debris, but there were ominous marks on the walls that couldn't be ignored. Just like in the first case, Tommy's body had been cut in the same places, precise incisions along the skin, where each cut seemed like a work of art, signifying more than just the killer's desire to dispose of a victim. It was something worse, cold, calculated planning. Tommy's body lay on the floor of the greenhouse, and there was no blood or signs of a struggle around it. Each time Reynolds looked at the cuts on the boy's body, he felt a cold shiver. They reminded him of the grim fate of every victim, stirring something dark within him, something more than professional caution, but true terror. The boy's body was mutilated, his hands twisted in an unnatural way. It looked as though someone had done it deliberately, leaving something important, but not for everyone to see. Reynolds began piecing together a picture in his mind that no longer seemed like just a string of random events. Everything he had seen pointed to this not being an isolated incident. More and more, it appeared that these murders were the result of a calculated, cold-blooded desire to hurt not only the victims but anyone caught in the path of this criminal. With each new step, Reynolds felt the pressure building. The number of victims was not decreasing, and he understood that this was far from over. Each new death hit him hard, and he began to feel the weight of the case becoming increasingly difficult to manage. Nothing about this case was predictable, but one thing was clear. The killer was determined, and he would continue, even if each of these incidents seemed like a small victory for him. Every day in Ridgeville grew harder, and the threat of an unknown killer cast a shadow over the town, deepening the fear that already gripped its residents. Fear pushed aside every other emotion, and every step, every movement seemed suspicious. Reynolds felt as if the case was slipping away from him, as though he were standing at the edge of a cliff where every move could lead to disaster. No matter how hard he tried, each new crime was more terrifying than the last, and each new victim seemed to confirm his worst fears. The killer was getting closer. The exhausting days of searching led him to one of the locals, Peter Wayne, a store clerk on the main street of Ridgeville. Wayne was known for often helping children, but his behavior always puzzled the adults. He was somewhat odd, reserved, quiet, with a look in his eyes that seemed soulless, as if a dark force was hiding within him, one that no one could quite figure out. And while there was nothing overtly criminal about him, Reynolds couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. This feeling never left him, and every new glance at Wayne only deepened his suspicions. Reynolds decided to take control of the situation. He ordered his FBI team to begin surveillance on Wayne. Every move this man made felt like a crucial clue, and Reynolds watched him closely, waiting for something significant to emerge. The surveillance continued for several days, and one evening, as night began to fall, Wayne left his home with a heavy old backpack. The bag seemed filled with something heavier than just ordinary travel gear. Reynolds ordered his team to follow him. It was the perfect setup for a terrifying scene. Wayne moved through the dark woods, his steps muffled by the sounds of the night wind. The backpack trailed behind him like a noose slowly tightening around his neck. He paused occasionally, as if hiding something in the darkness. The silence around them became so deafening that Reynolds could feel his own heartbeat quickening. He knew this was the moment when everything would be revealed, when the dark secret would finally come to light. When Wayne reached a shallow pit, he began digging with his hands, stirring the earth. And in that moment, as he bent down to bury something, several officers emerged from the woods. Wayne lifted his head and saw them, but didn't have time to react. He was quickly restrained, thrown face first to the ground, and prepared for arrest. In his hands, he was clutching a bound boy, his face hidden beneath dirt and terror, his trembling fingers writhing in pain. Wayne started screaming, at first unintelligible, but as his hands were bound, he broke down and cried. Through his tears and with a tight throat, he confessed, "It's me. I've been killing the kids. But I couldn't help it." He made me do it. He said I had to. He controlled everything. I was just a tool." These words shocked the officers. They checked him over, but Wayne seemed so terrified that none of them could believe he was just the ramblings of a madman. Reynolds, watching the tears fall to the ground, couldn't believe what he was hearing. Wayne didn't look like a predator, he looked like a victim. The man was so broken that his confession seemed more like the consequences of moral and psychological enslavement than actual crimes. Taken to the station, Wayne was interrogated for hours, but his story grew even more baffling. He couldn't explain exactly who forced him to kill, but he pointed to an invisible, sinister figure who supposedly controlled his actions. Wayne referred to this person as him, offering no further details, only muttering that it was someone who watched him constantly and even commanded him through dreams. His words became less coherent, almost chaotic, and what began as an accusation turned into a bad fantasy. Sheriff Crow, used to simpler and more straightforward cases, was satisfied with the result. The suspect had confessed. To him, the case was closed, and Wayne no longer mattered. But Reynolds couldn't believe that this was it. What he saw in Wayne didn't match the brutal and calculated murders. This wasn't a psychopath, a cold-blooded killer, but a terrified man who had likely become a victim of something much worse. But who was he? And why did this man, so broken, seem to carry a burden far greater than the mere desire to kill? Reynolds couldn't leave it unanswered. Pulling his gaze from these horrific memories, he knew this case was just beginning. Reynolds couldn't wrap his head around it. All the evidence he'd been gathering suddenly pointed to something he didn't want to acknowledge. His suspicions about Sheriff Crow seemed impossible, yet more and more details made him dig deeper. At first, it was small things. Records of the night shifts Crow had worked on the same nights the disappearances occurred, his odd presence at the site of every first body discovery. At first glance, it all seemed like coincidence, but Reynolds' experience told him otherwise. There are no coincidences in cases like this. The more he went through the documents, the more his unease grew. No one had noticed Crow's strange behavior, but Reynolds felt there was something hidden beneath the surface. For hours, the agent sifted through papers, reviewing reports, phone logs, and surveillance footage. All the threads led to one conclusion: Sheriff Crow was hiding something. Reynolds decided it was time to act. He filed for a search warrant for the sheriff's large woodland house. The house was located far from town, in a secluded part of the forest where locals didn't dare go without reason. Its location alone was suspicious, but the fact that almost no one knew about it made everything feel even more unsettling. Late that evening, as darkness enveloped the town, Reynolds' team headed toward the house. The branches of trees bent under the weight of the wind, and every step on the old gravel driveway echoed like a hammer strike. As they approached the house, they saw an old structure with a sagging roof that almost blended into the night sky. Only a faint light from one of the windows suggested that the house wasn't abandoned. Breaking down the door, the team entered. At first, it seemed like an ordinary house. Old furniture, dust on the floor, the scent of wood. But as they moved further inside, they came across locked doors leading to a room that looked nothing like the others. When the lock was broken, what lay behind it was pure nightmare. The walls of the room were covered with photographs of missing children. Some images were taken just days before their disappearance. Others looked like they had been taken after death. In the corner of the room lay blood-stained tools: knives, pliers, hammers. Everything appeared to have been used for unspeakable acts that even the darkest nightmares couldn't fully imagine. But the worst was yet to come. One of the agents found a hidden hatch in the floor. It opened with a creak, revealing dark stairs leading down to a basement. The descent was difficult. The air was thick with dampness, and an unfamiliar stench filled their nostrils, making them feel nauseous. At the very end of the basement, they came upon a room that appeared to be designed for torture. Metal chains hung from the walls, their surfaces covered in dark stains, likely blood. Drag marks were visible on the floor, and beside them lay a journal. It was open to a page with a list of names. Some were crossed out. Those were the names of the missing children whose bodies had already been found. But the page didn't end there. The list also contained names of children who had yet to be discovered, and among them was one that made Reynolds' heart stop. The name of a 9-year-old girl who had gone missing just the day before. Her name hadn't been crossed out. Reynolds and his team stepped into Sheriff Crow's office, each footstep echoing too loudly, as though signaling the inevitable terror that was about to unfold. The sheriff sat behind his desk, his face dimly lit by the desk lamp in the fading light of the room. A cold, stone-like grin was frozen on his face, but his eyes burned with a wild, dangerous gleam. "We know everything, Crow," Reynolds said quietly, aiming his gun at the sheriff. "You have no way out." Crow raised his hands, showing his palms, but his movements were slow, as if he were playing out his final scene. "Do you think you've stopped something big?" he growled, tilting his head ominously. "You have no idea. This is just the beginning." His hand shot out suddenly, grabbing a large knife hidden under the desk, and Crow lunged forward. The first strike was so fast that the agent standing closest couldn't react in time. The knife sliced through his throat, blood spraying across the wall. The rest of the team immediately raised their weapons, but Crow, with terrifying speed, flipped the desk over, creating a barricade. "You're not ready for this?" he growled, grabbing a hammer that had been lying under the desk. He charged toward the agents with brutal force. One strike shattered the skull of another agent, leaving him lifeless on the floor. Blood flooded the room, reflecting in the light of the lamp. Reynolds tried to fire, but Crow hurled a chair, knocking him off his feet. The agent felt something crack in his shoulder. "Thought you were heroes?" Crow hissed, getting closer to Reynolds. "You can't change anything." Summoning all his strength, Reynolds fired. The bullet hit the sheriff in the side, but it didn't stop him. Crow howled like a wounded beast and lunged through the window. The shattered glass flew in all directions as he vanished into the night air. Reynolds grabbed his shoulder, pressing down on the wound, and ran after him. The forest greeted him with oppressive darkness. Branches grabbed at his clothes like grasping hands, and every sound seemed amplified, menacing. Finally, he saw Crow. The sheriff stood by an old oak tree, bathed in moonlight. Blood trickled from his side, but he stood still, as if in his final act. "You won't win," Reynolds rasped, aiming his gun at him. Crow just laughed. His laughter was chilling, as if it echoed from the very depths of hell. "You don't understand, Agent. I'm just the beginning." Suddenly, Crow lunged forward. Their clash was brutal and unforgiving. Crow's knife flashed in the air, slashing through Reynolds' stomach. He felt his strength drain, but gritting his teeth, he swung the butt of his pistol into the sheriff's head. Crow collapsed, gasping and choking on his own blood. "You lost," Reynolds whispered, collapsing beside him. At that moment, reinforcements finally arrived. Crow was apprehended, but even as they dragged him away, he kept laughing. "You think this is the end?" he shouted. His laughter echoed as they took him away. Crow stood in the courtroom, cold and unwavering, as the judge read the verdict. Death by electric chair. The room filled with whispers, but Crow merely smiled faintly, as though it weren't about him at all. His eyes, dark as bottomless wells, showed no fear for even a second. But that was just a mask. Deep inside, he knew his time had nearly run out. On the day of the execution, he sat in his cell, hearing every sound from the neighboring room. The metal chair awaited him like an unyielding judge, ready to carry out its final command. When they strapped Crow into the chair and affixed the electrodes to his head, silence hung in the air. The first charge surged through his body, making him convulse violently. The metal straps dug into his flesh, and his skin began to burn, filling the room with the stench of charred flesh. His face contorted in an expression of unimaginable pain, and his eyes rolled back, as if seeing something no one else could. Crow gasped, trying to make a sound, but it was in vain. The body no longer obeyed him. The second charge obliterated whatever was left of his control. His muscles jerked like marionettes, and blood slowly dripped from the cuts on his wrists. Silence fell only when the monitor showed a flat line. But even in death, the faces of those present were filled with terror. Crow's eyes still held the hatred and defiance that seemed to linger even in death. Subscribe to the channel, leave a like, and share your thoughts in the comments about Crow's fate. Do you think this was truly the end for him? And remember, dark secrets always find a way to surface.